Right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us here today. I'm Ben Garfinkel, the director of the Center for the Governance of AI. We're a research and field building organization based in Oxford, UK. And we have a focus on understanding and helping to address risks from advanced AI. I'm very excited for today's seminar, which will focus on a recent multi-author paper called Frontier AI Regulation, Managing Emerging Risks to Public Safety. The paper offers a wide-ranging tour of some of the regulatory challenges that advanced AI systems could pose. It also attempts to sketch some of the building blocks that might be involved in an effective regulatory regime. So we have with us today two of the paper's authors, Markus Anderljung and Cullen, who will be presenting on the paper together. Markus is the head of policy here at GovAI. He is also an adjunct fellow at the Center for New American Security and a member of the OECD AI Policy Observatory's expert group on AI futures. Cullen is a research scientist in governance at OpenAI, also a research affiliate at GovAI and a co-founder of the Legal Priorities Project. We're also very lucky to have us with here today, Irene Solaiman, and also perhaps joining us a bit later, Jeremy Howard, who will be offering commentary on the paper. Irene and Jeremy are, in my view, two of the most important and interesting thinkers in the AI governance space today. I also think they have some viewpoints that differ in useful and important ways from the viewpoints presented in the paper. Irene is the policy director at Hugging Face. She's also a tech ethics and policy mentor at Stanford University and an international strategy forum fellow at Schmidt Futures. Her research covers a wide range of highly relevant topics, including responsible release practices and strategies for combating the misuse of AI. Jeremy is an AI researcher, educator, and entrepreneur. He's also a co-founder of Fast.ai, a research institute dedicated to making deep learning more accessible. He's also an honorary professor at the University of Queensland. Of particular note for today's event, Jeremy also recently authored a fascinating and insightful essay responding to the Frontier AI Regulation paper. The essay is called AI Safety in the Age of Disenlightenment. And along with the paper itself, I would consider it recommended reading for anyone who's attending today's event. So with that preface out of the way, I'm excited for us to jump in. I'll also be turning the keys to the event over to Emma Blumke, GovAI's research manager, to moderate the no doubt lively discussion in the back half of the event. All right, so Cullen and Markus, are you ready to jump in?
Yeah, thank you all so much, and thank you all for coming in and attending the event. Hopefully, we'll have Jeremy join us. It's very late over in Australia, and so there's a chance that he might have fallen asleep. We'll see. Let me just take a moment and could someone allow screen sharing, please? And while that's happening. Yeah, so what I'll be doing is sort of together with Cullen, we'll be going through sort of summarizing this recent paper that we put together with a number of co-authors. I should be able to. Great. Yeah, so we will be presenting the sort of most of the content from this paper, Frontier Regulation, Managing Emerging Risks to Public Safety. It's been written with a number of colleagues. Some of them you can, or all of them you can see here from a number of different institutions. We will, for the most part, be sort of summarizing the paper, but we'll also be offering our own perspectives. What we say will not necessarily reflect either the views of sort of all the other authors, nor necessarily their respective sort of organizations that we work for. So first, we'll sort of go through why one might want to regulate frontier AI in particular. We'll also discuss sort of what kinds of requirements you might expect it to be useful for developers of these systems to meet. And then we'll go through what this sort of shape of a regulatory regime might look like. I'll hand over to Cullen for this first bit.
Thanks, Markus. Great. So we start off by defining this important term that's the centerpiece of the paper, which is frontier AI. And we kind of loosely define it to mean highly capable foundation models that could exhibit sufficiently dangerous capabilities. So just to zoom in on this a little bit, we're first limiting ourselves to foundation models, which are kind of defined in the academic ML literature as models that can be adapted to a wide range of downstream tasks and therefore exhibit some level of generality. We're also limiting ourselves to models that could exhibit sufficiently dangerous capabilities. And to really emphasize what we mean by this, we're worried about capabilities that pose risks of a significant scale. where we would consider the risk to rise to the level of being a matter of public safety and kind of global security, where there's a strong imperative to kind of prevent these risks rather than just respond to them or learn to adapt to them over time. So just to kind of give some examples of the types of dangerous capabilities that we think foundation models could have in the near future, and happy to kind of support this claim in discussion if people are interested in it. So worried about the future ability of foundation models to design novel pathogens, or be able to hack into a wide variety of secure computer systems, so engage in cyber offense, or in the longer run future, kind of evade human control, such as through deceiving humans or otherwise kind of wresting themselves out of human control. Yeah, and we take quite seriously the possibility that next generation foundation models will possess these capabilities, and we're kind of trying to inhabit epistemic humility in the face of kind of the difficulty of predicting what capabilities foundation models will have ex ante, and kind of the empirical result that the capabilities of foundation models tend to often emerge quite discontinuously in a lot of cases. We realize that this definition relies on a lot of fuzzy judgment calls, so it's not yet a technical definition, and there should be a lot of work trying to make this definition more technically precise. But we also want to be clear that this should be a very high bar and have clear exclusions for AI development and deployment activities that have been empirically de-risked and shown not to rise to this very high level of risk that we are worried about. So for example, we think that with current techniques, we can pretty comfortably say that foundation models trained with fewer than, say, 10 to the 26 flop, we can quibble with this exact number, but something in that range will likely not meet this bar. And so there should be some level around this level of flop that would be just categorically excluded for the avoidance of ambiguity. Although we would, we would emphasize that this exact limit should probably change over time due to algorithmic progress, which is a thing that we can discuss. Similarly, we think that kind of models trained for a very specific task, such as narrowly generating music, or modeling weather, or modeling physics, even if they could have very dangerous applications, should probably be excluded and tackled with a different regulatory regime rather than the one that we're dealing with here. Okay, so a core thesis of the paper that we'll try to briefly defend here is that we may need to regulate frontier AI beginning at the development stage, not just based on how models are deployed. This is kind of a dispreferred method of regulation in a lot of contexts, and so we think it's important for us to try to defend why we think it's necessary, in particular by contrasting it to the normal way that we would regulate things in technology, which are things like sector-specific regulation. Okay, so why might sector-specific regulation not be appropriate? So yeah, just to briefly define it, sector-specific regulation would be where you regulate how these frontier AI models are integrated into high-risk or regulated sectors, such as finance, banking, healthcare, government services, criminal justice, et cetera. Obviously, we think that those are super important things and are very thankful to people who are thinking very carefully about how that ought to happen. However, the thing that we're worried about is that the same foundation model in both regulated and unregulated, obviously it's a spectrum, sectors, where, yeah, and what this means is that the underlying capabilities of that model, and therefore any dangerous capabilities that it possesses, will be accessible to actors in both regulated and unregulated sectors, meaning that there are still huge vectors for risk, even if you have very good and well-calibrated sector-specific regulation. The other big challenge that we're worried about is that even just applying blanket rules on how users are allowed to use these frontier AI models is likely to be insufficient. And we we kind of like try to motivate this problem by discussing three relatively unique traits of frontier AI models that we think make usage-based regulation likely to be insufficient. So the first is what we call the unexpected capabilities problem, which I alluded to earlier, which is that it's very difficult to reliably predict all the capabilities of a model ex ante, and even like hard to predict after like internal testing by the company. So a classic example of this is that chain of thought prompting has greatly expanded the capabilities of large language models, but was not discovered until I think like years after GPT-3 was deployed, for example. It's also like things like fine tuning and other ways that these models can be modified or changed ex post make this problem harder. The second is that, as I think most people know, is it's quite hard for even companies who have a strong desire to prevent their models from being misused to reliably prevent them from doing so. And in fact, it's like often like users are often exposed to like undesired behavior. So the models can behave in ways that neither users nor developers intend them to. And this means that like imposing a requirement that developers regulate how models can be used can be quite difficult. And the final one is that frontier AI models can proliferate pretty widely as digital goods. They're zero marginal cost to replicate, etc. And these problems all interact with each other as well. In this this diagram kind of shows some of the key dynamics here. Unfortunately, I don't have time to like get into all of it, but these problems kind of like amplify and play off each other. So just to zoom in on a particular problem that might be a point of discussion later is that the unexpected capabilities problem means it's like really quite hard at the after the model is built to like really fully understand how important non-proliferation is, which is why we kind of advocate for a more anticipatory approach that allows for a privileged period of kind of capabilities examination in a more controlled setting so that regulators can make more informed decisions before taking the irreversible step of allowing the model to be open sourced in a way that is basically irretrievable. So with that, I'll hand it over to Markus, who will discuss some of our recommendations.
Great. Thank you, Cullen. So I'll start going through sort of what kinds of requirements you might want to might want frontier AI developers to follow. We propose some sort of initial suggestions for what those requirements might look like. Those requirements should and will adapt over time. This is sort of a pretty nascent space. We're still learning a lot about sort of what the risks of these models are and what one might do to mitigate those risks. So I think that's important to highlight at the outset. So the first sort of set of procedures or practices that we talk about are sort of making sure that these developers conduct sort of thorough risk assessments ahead of a model deployment. So before a model is put out there into the world, you should have a decent sense of what the risks and benefits of doing so are. Those risk assessments, we think, should be, to a large extent, they should be informed by assessments and evaluations of the extent to which the models have certain dangerous capabilities. So whether they can sort of engage in some of the behaviors that Cullen sort of outlined above, and also trying to understand sort of the controllability of the model. So the extent to which it's possible for example, for a developer to make sure that users can't use the model for certain kinds of things, and also the extent to which the model might sort of accidentally sort of engage in some of these sort of risky behaviors or use some of these sort of dangerous capabilities, even though the user didn't even intend that to be the case. And then these risk assessments, probably we shouldn't leave these sort of really quite important questions only in the purview of AI developers. Instead, it seems very important that these models sort of see scrutiny from a lot of external experts. This might be via audits, this might be via red teaming, and so on. And then these risk assessments, they ought to inform decisions about how and whether these models are end up being deployed and how they are put out there into the world. For certain models, deploying them won't simply be worth the risk. For others, it may be a good thing to sort of make them just freely available to anyone, sort of make them open access or open source. And for most models that are sort of pushing the frontier of sort of capabilities and that are sort of using more compute than any model to date, for example, I would expect it to be the case that it might make sense to deploy them, but if so, with sort of appropriate safeguards. So for example, it might be wise to deploy them via an API so that the model can be sort of continually assessed for sort of new behaviors and new kinds of risks, and also trying to understand how users are sort of actually engaging with the model and sort of what the downstream impacts of the model might be. And that might then allow you to sort of roll back the model or sort of at least add in additional safeguards if it proves more harmful than you thought, similar to sort of what we might be able to do with automobiles, for example. And this is a little figure that sort of describes these different levels that you could imagine. These sort of levels of sort of the assessed risk deciding that will be really quite difficult and likely to be quite contentious. And I expect that to be a sort of a really crucial part of getting this regulatory regime right is sort of getting this mapping correct between what is this model capable of, what are the risks of this model, and what does that mean for how it can or should be deployed. And then sort of once the model is deployed, there should be a number of requirements to do with sort of monitoring and responding to new information on sort of model capabilities and sort of the impacts of the model, despite sort of our best efforts from regulators, from society at large, from AI developers. How AI systems are used and sort of will sort of continue to evolve, and it will also surprise us. These models might have sort of new capabilities that we didn't initially expect, and so that means that you sort of need to keep an eye out for those developments and sort of continually reassess the extent to which the way that the model is deployed seems sensible, and also the extent to which other actions might need to be taken to reduce various kinds of risks. So to, for example, defend against certain kinds of misuses. In addition to this, we sort of expect there to be a lot of other practices that will end up being important. I think one that seems very likely to be sensible now would be things to do with ensuring that these companies have sufficient levels of cybersecurity or sort of information security in place to sort of stop these models from being stolen. As these models become more and more sort of economically valuable and sort of useful for national security purposes, for example, we should expect more and more actors, including nation states, to potentially be interested in trying to get a hold of these models in an illicit manner. And it might be the case that it seems pretty plausible to me that these frontier developers, they won't sufficiently internalize the risks of these models being stolen. And so we might need sort of governments to step in and sort of impose some kinds of requirements here. So that's sort of a broad sketch of the kinds of requirements that you might want to ensure that frontier developers follow. But that's only a sort of a piece of what this sort of regulatory regime might look like. Sort of what would sort of more the mechanics of this regulatory regime look like? We talk about sort of 3 building blocks that might be needed for frontier AI regulation. The first one is sort of standard setting. So we will need to have a better understanding of what AI models sort of pose risks. We need to have standards and best practices on how to mitigate those risks. And we will need to sort of develop those over time and sort of refine those. And these will sort of then form the basis of regulation. And that's quite often sort of how regulatory regimes will end up being built up over time, especially in a US context, that you sort of have these standards first being developed, and then those over time get sort of incorporated into sort of a regulatory regime that sort of might mandate the following of certain kinds of requirements. It's also the case that governments can probably play a really important role in sort of incentivizing and overseeing the development of these standards as well, to make sure that they are sort of look like they are sort of in line with the public interest. Another important bit is ensuring that you have sufficient regulatory visibility. So currently, most governments lack a lot of insight and a lot of expertise to sort of understand developments of sort of some of the most capable AI systems. This seems like a big problem. Without such information, governments and sort of society at large will struggle to hold AI developers sort of accountable to the public interest. And so that seems like another important bucket to work on. It seems to me that there's a decent amount of progress being made on these first 2 building blocks. One example is sort of in the UK, where the UK government was sort of promised early access to new models from some of the leading AI labs. And governments, including the EU, are also starting to sort of pressure these developers to produce sort of concrete standards and sort of best practices, and really define what it might mean to sort of be acting responsibly in developing these technologies. But we will probably need a lot more. I think it will be the case that at some point, someone, maybe that will be for example, in the UK, it seems likely that the foundation model task force might help run evaluations, for example, on sort of some of these models before they sort of see the light of day, or before they're sort of deployed widely into society. At some point, you're going to find something worrying, and at that point, my guess is that we cannot rely on sort of the goodwill of these companies to then sort of behave responsibly in light of that. And so my guess is that we will need to have some ways of sort of enforcing compliance with sort of safety standards, such as the ones that we sort of discussed above. Getting that enforcement right seems really quite tricky, but there's a lot of different options, many of which we sort of explore in the paper. I think one way to think about it is that there are sort of 3 important dimensions that you might need to think about when you figure out how to set up that regime that sort of enforces compliance with these kinds of requirements. One is sort of when you intervene, when you ensure compliance. So you could do so before a model is deployed or before sort of an activity starts. So you could do that via a license or some kind of pre-approval. You could also do it after the fact. So you would sort of mandate that certain sort of requirements or certain sort of procedures are followed, and then you have a sort of some regulatory body that can sort of ex post after the fact enforce those kinds of requirements and sort of identify non-compliance and punish it somehow. Another important dimension is sort of when you intervene in sort of the AI supply chain. Do you do so at the level of the deployment of these systems, when they sort of are made available to lots of users or to downstream companies, or do you intervene even earlier at the stage of sort of these models being developed in the first place? And then a third dimension that also seems useful to keep in mind is whether you are intervening on or sort of imposing requirements on what kinds of entities can engage in certain kinds of behaviors, or whether you focus on sort of certain kinds of activities. In the paper, we sort of lay out a bunch of different options here about what kind of compliance might make sense. Some of the things that we end up saying is that it seems sensible to have sort of ex post. I guess the first thing to note is sort of our sort of overall message is something like self-governance or sort of self-regulatory regimes to ensure sort of compliance with these kinds of safety standards. Seems like it would be somewhat helpful, but it seems very unlikely to sort of cut it. And so some kind of sort of regulatory intervention will likely be needed is sort of the overall claim. And then we sort of say that it seems useful to have ex post enforcement for deployment decisions. Seems like a very important basis. So if an actor ends up sort of behaving irresponsibly, or sort of maybe they could reasonably have anticipated some large risk from a certain deployment decision, for example. It just seems very important that there is some part of the government, some means for sort of democratic input and democratic some kind of democratic input into that decision, and sort of being able to sanction non-compliance with sort of reasonable requirements. We also sort of suggest that it could be the case that requirements regarding the development process could also be wise. I think I pointed to one, which was this stuff around how sort of information security might be something that's really quite important even before deployment, because you have the model, and so the model might still might get stolen even though it's not been deployed. There's some other reasons that you might want to push sort of earlier into the development process. One thing might be if sort of decisions at the development process is really quite important in sort of deciding what the final product might look like. And so in a lot of other sort of regulatory domains, for example, in deciding whether and how to construct a power plant, for example, you might have sort of approvals ahead of time before you sort of put a shovel into the ground. And then another one is that we should expect these models to be used even before they hit the market. So they might be used sort of, for example, within these companies. And if that sort of usage within these companies, if that comes with risks, then that might suggest that you might want to move sort of earlier on in sort of the supply chain. And then we also say that it could be the case that sort of licenses and sort of pre-approvals could be appropriate for deployment. One analogy here might be to sort of maybe pharmaceuticals or to aviation, where before you put a new drug on the market or before you sort of put a plane in the sky with people on it, you need to have gone through a large number of steps to make sure that will probably be safe and won't cause significant harm. You could imagine that you might even need these kinds of licenses or these kinds of pre-approvals for development. And so one example here is sort of engaging with sort of select agents or sort of some quite dangerous biological viruses and whatnot. That has certain requirements on it in terms of sort of making sure that your lab has sufficient levels of security. You're sort of sufficiently cautious about making sure that this pathogen doesn't leak and these kinds of things. And you might imagine that if the models are being developed, if they are sort of risky enough early on enough in the process, you might imagine that those kinds of licenses might also make sense. Overall, this is quite a complicated space. There's a lot of open questions, and I think it's difficult to get the sort of the design of this regulatory regime right. Here's a list of some of the open questions that sort of we have, and sort of we sort of discuss more in the paper. But I think it's important to note that I don't think these kinds of open questions shouldn't sort of stop us from sort of engaging in these questions. I think more so this should sort of motivate us to start taking the right steps that are needed to build this kind of regulatory regime. It seems very likely to me that we will need some way for sort of democratic and sort of accountability in how these models are developed and deployed. And to do that, I think there are lots of steps that we could take today, and I think we will eventually need some kind of regulatory regime along the lines of sort of what we ended up describing in the paper. And I'm excited to sort of hear some of the thoughts and comments from Irene and from Jeremy. Really good to see you, Jeremy. Thank you for joining us, and thank you all very much.
Excellent, thank you, Markus. Irene, would you also like to share your screen, or would you just like to take it away with your comments, and then we'll have Jeremy follow?
I do not have a presentation, so I am going to harness my theater child background of being very animated and passionate about my points here. So the three high-level questions that I think through when approaching regulation and also this paper are: what is the system? What are the aspects of the system that are being regulated and who's responsible for it? And what needs to be improved across sectors for regulation to be effective? I have a lot of overlapping thoughts with what will be Jeremy's presentation later. So excited for the discussion after that. But when I'm thinking about the systems, generally my approach is sector specific. And a huge question that I continually have is what constitutes a frontier model, especially when I'm thinking about regulation. It's so easy to overfit to models. And I always use the term system to be really inclusive of the many components that go into building a system, and also to better glamorize the work that needs to happen around data sets, make data sets sexy. There's so much more research and also attention on the policy side that needs to be given to data sets, processes, a lot outside of a model. And also, I think a lot about release methods and the kinds of responsibilities throughout system development, not just model. So when I'm thinking about what should be the access or regulatory regime for a non-frontier AI model, what is that? And the how do we decide that as well? Since I don't think as a community we are upset that BERT or GPT-1 is fully open, but then there's a lot more fuzziness around the BARDs and the GPT-4s of the world, and that middle zone just requires so much more research. On the what aspects are being regulated, part of the excitement of AI why it's being developed is for shared benefit. And that requires more people contributing to the field in many ways, which requires access. So when I think about release, I don't just think about releasing components. I think about how do we empower the different groups who need to give feedback to improve systems, to get access in terms of even more research infrastructure, in terms of better interfaces, and ensuring that we have safeguards where a regime isn't too restrictive that it prevents that kind of access, but being specific about it for what ways can we prevent model leakage, or like there's just always going to be internet gremlins, and minimize the gremlininess of what they could do with these systems. And then what needs to be improved across sectors is really our understanding and acceptance of trade-offs of benefits and harms. So there's the guidelines for deployment right now are just not firm. How people are considering trade-offs when they're deploying systems, and how they're deciding applications is pretty unstructured right now. There's so many great proposals in this paper, like monitoring and evaluation, and part of why I'm pushing back on explicitly this regime moving forward is just where we are with understanding monitoring and evaluation. I am so pro requesting that this happen for all systems. And this is it's not yet, it's a more grown than a baby. This is my research small child now. I want so much more in investment in evals and understanding what are sufficiently dangerous capabilities for whom, who is this risk affecting most, who is represented when they are able to give more clarity and color to that risk. A lot of the kinds of harms that are catastrophic can be catastrophic for different people on different timelines. This also overlaps with capability evals. This is my recent soapbox, and I'm going to be on it. We don't, as a community, have a good consensus on what constitutes a highly capable system. The example that I give in my lectures is between a formerly DALL-E Mini, now Crayon, and Stable Diffusion. You can kind of see that quality difference because it's very visual. It is image generative, and you can see that from like a GPT-1 to GPT-4, but we don't have standards for capability benchmarks right now. So understanding like where should we draw that line? What is that threshold? And how do we ensure that that decision is not just made by people who are closest to models, but people who can give that input, is where I'm focusing a ton of my energy. My main takeaways from this colorful rant is that no one piece of regulation is going to address all aspects of AI, nor is it meant to. And adjusting requirements per level of risk in a given use case is one of the most promising ways that we can move forward with where we're at. When we're addressing something like foundation systems, models, moving forward specific requirements for a base system can be really helpful here. So that could be disclosure and documentation. We've seen this become a really productive norm in the space, and doing the groundwork for impact or risk assessments. Overall, more interdisciplinary work is needed. And also, part of why I am looking at these kinds of overarching regulatory proposals like the EU AI Act that goes into sector-specific considerations is so that we can extrapolate to the AI systems that are deeply impacting people's lives that are not foundation models. And hopefully we can take some of these lessons like disclosure and documentation and apply it to so much needs attention. Why is there still predictive recidivism tools being used in the US? Absolute garbage. So it is also a resourcing issue on the policy side, but I'm really excited that this conversation is moving forward.
Excellent. So to the audience, just so you know, you can submit questions to any of the panelists. If Markus and Cullen would like to do any responses now for a little bit of a discussion, we can do that. Alternatively, we can move on to Jeremy's section for Jeremy to add his comments and then add a larger discussion at the end. Markus?
Yeah, I mean, lots of thoughts on what Irene said. Thank you so much for offering your thoughts and taking your time to be here with us. Yeah, I guess I'll pick up on a few little bits of this smorgasbord. One thing is I think Yeah, I think you're completely right that there's lots of things that need to be done in this space, and so my guess is that if it were the case that my view would be if it were the case that the only thing that happened was that sort of regulation of these frontier models was put in place, then that would most likely be a mistake, and that governments need to be considering doing a whole ton of different things. I think there's a lot of things that need to be done on this sort of use-based or sort of sector-specific side of things, and so questions about, well, how do I decide whether to deploy or use an AI system for a particular use case, and that will need a ton of work from lots of regulators all over the world. I think you're also right that so there's another, in my mind, there are two reasons that you might want to sort of move up the supply chain onto sort of considering foundation models as sort of a specific regulatory target. One is the stuff that we talked about, so the sort of dangerous capabilities type framing and this dangerous capabilities type query. Another one is this thing of if it's the case that these models are foundation models, they are the foundation of lots of AI applications downstream. That kind of sort of position in the supply chain might mean that sort of you need to intervene there. And so I think those are sort of, to my mind, some of the sort of strongest arguments for why you might need that intervention to sort of do things like make sure the documentation is really good, make sure that sort of the downstream developer actually has the tool, or the downstream sort of company or actor that's sort of using the models, making sure that they have the tools and the knowledge they need to be able to use the models appropriately. And I think those kinds of requirements will likely be really quite helpful and really quite important. And then another thing I'll pick up on a little bit, but yeah, Cullen will also have lots of great and useful thoughts here. Is this question of sort of what is a frontier model? I think that is sort of I guess one of the sort of core things to get right in this kind of regulatory regime. In the paper, the way that we talk about it is we try to make the scope really quite narrow, and so the hope is to sort of if you're going to do things that might look like sort of it's reasonably burdensome to move these requirements upstream, move them into sort of maybe even into the development process, probably that sort of suggests that you should be focusing on sort of the most risky types of models. And so in the paper, we offer lots of different considerations and lots of different ways in which you might sort of try to define these systems. One thing to just get a handle on what we're at least trying to point to is Cullen pointed to this sort of models that are more than 10 to the 26 use more than 10 to the 26 flop in their training. That would put such models above any model that has ever been created to date. And so the thought there is at the very least, models that are sort of use more compute than any model to date, those will likely, if it's the case that sort of scaling continues, if it's the case that sort of models that use more and more compute, if those will have sort of new capabilities and be able to do sort of new things, we probably won't understand what that next generation of model, we can't predict now what they will be capable of. And so I think we should sort of be humble and think that there's some chance that those will have those sort of sufficiently dangerous capabilities. And so that's one way that we sort of try to point to this sufficiently, these frontier models that might have these sufficiently dangerous capabilities. And then the other way to do it would be over time, as we actually like have models developed that do have these capabilities that one might be worried about, or at least sufficiently worried that they require some kind of intervention, some kind of attention, then you might sort of adjust this requirement. So you might say, oh, okay, yeah, if it's a model that's sort of more capable than any model we have to date, that one you should pay attention to, and you should do the risk assessments really, really thoroughly and whatnot. But then in addition, we know that this model that's sort of not at the frontier, that used a lot less compute than sort of the frontier, or sort of the most capable models out there, we might still know that one's sufficiently dangerous and might still need these kinds of interventions. I'll also just note that I think you're completely right that like a lot of these requirements that we talk about in the paper and the ones that I walk through, to a large extent, these are just, to my mind, just kind of common sense things that you would want any actor that uses AI and develops AI to be engaging with. And then I think that the sort of the important question then is just like how much and to what extent should you expect these, or would you like these actors to engage in these behaviors? And the extent to which it sort of warranted for the government to sort of step in and require these kinds of practices are adhered to. And so I could imagine that, yeah, you could have a regime that looks like, lots of development should follow these requirements, and those requirements should scale with various kinds of things, including the sort of some measure of sort of the capabilities of the system.
So in the matter of time, I'd like to move on to allow Jeremy to have some comments. And then we do have questions popping up at the Q&A. Please do vote to help us select, because we won't have time to go through all of them. Jeremy, I'd like to invite you to come up and say your comments.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you, Markus and Irene and Cullen. I wanted to really focus in on the very specific and unusual policy recommendation that the paper's focused on, which is the recommendation to require licensing or approval before deployment of frontier models specifically. And I want to do it in a very specific case. And that is the case where, what if AI turns out to be the most powerful technology in history? What if it turns out to be more powerful than humans? What if it turns out to be a super intelligence? The reason I want to focus on this is because we can come back, and I will come back later, to the question of like, well, what if it's not? And if it's not, then it's like, oh, maybe it's as capable, powerful as the internet, computers, things which are really powerful and important, but we regulate those things in very different ways to the way that the frontier AI models regulation is proposing. The frontier AI models regulation is proposing something very different, which is, and it's basically founded on this premise, like, what if this could be an incredibly powerful technology, so powerful that a single person could do something catastrophic, could destroy society, could destroy the existence of the species. And the thing I found about this proposal, the frontier AI regulation proposal, and other proposals of its type, is that they are founded on the assumption that this technology could be the most powerful technology in history, but they do not ever take that seriously when considering, okay, well, what would happen if this regulation is put in place and that premise turns out to be true, that it is that we end up with superintelligence? What would the world look like? So what we would have would be a regulation where the most powerful technology in history is only available in its most powerful form to a small slice of humanity. And we have to think, well, what does that mean? What would the world look like in that case? You see, there's a very important thing to know, which is there are two ways that you can access a model of these kinds. You can either get the actual model itself, the weights, the activations, the ability to change it, so full access to the model. Or you can just access it through a service interface like ChatGPT. In the latter case, you have something much, much less powerful. The only way to get the full power of a model is to have access to its weights and its activations and the ability to actually change it directly yourself. Now, the thing is, there is no way to secure that latter thing. That latter thing is a general purpose computation device. It's a computer. And you can't say, okay, we've made it so it's impossible to use a computer in a particular way, because you can program a computer. And in the same way with a model, you can adjust its weights to do whatever you want. So if you want to be able to secure these frontier AI models to ensure that they're safe, then you can't actually let people have access to the full thing, because it's literally impossible to secure. It's a general purpose computation device. It would be as impossible as trying to secure a pen or a pencil so somebody can't write a blackmail note with it. You can't. These are general purpose devices. So why is this a problem? Well, the reason it's a problem is that if some companies provide interfaces to these models, if they build the models and let people use them through a secured, insured, safe interface, the full version of the model still exists somewhere, right? that still exists inside that company somewhere. Some people have access to it. If this technology is the most powerful technology in history, if it's a superintelligence, it provides the keys to power. It is the thing which you could use to control the world, to control all wealth, to do anything you wanted. And we're saying the only people that get access to the most powerful version of that thing is a small slice of humanity. A small slice of people at this big company or big companies who are actually controlling that underlying model. So how do you think that's going to go? How has it gone in history when there have been two groups of people, one small group with access to a huge amount of technological power, and one much bigger group that doesn't? The answer is generally that hasn't gone very well, particularly when that small group with access to the full power of a more powerful technology has the ability to use that to increase their power and increase their wealth. This is why we have democracy. This is why we have the Enlightenment. It used to be considered by most of humanity, or at least most of the people that controlled the power in humanity, that powerful technologies like the ability to vote, the ability to write, access to education were indeed two powerful things to allow most people to have. And so most people did not have those things. And we had a big change in the 17th and 18th centuries, and from then onwards, the Enlightenment, which is where we took a very different direction as a society. And we said, well, you know what? What would happen if we actually took a very different direction? So let's give everybody those things and assume that the kind of society at large can use that power to help each other. There will be bad actors, but the good actors overall will end up the right thing happening on average most of the time. And this is the kind of way I think we need to be thinking of this, because to me, to say, here is a system which bakes into law a requirement that only a small slice of humanity has access to the full power of humanity's most powerful technology cannot be safe. There's no way to make that resilient. And so it's my view that if this regulation was put in place, then if AI turns out to be super powerful, then it will destroy society, or it's very likely to destroy society. It's very likely to create a huge power struggle, a huge amount of violence, as people desperately try to ensure that they're the ones that control this technology, because that's how it's been throughout history. And so I think we have to take this very seriously. We actually have to think, what if humanity is creating superintelligence? What if humanity is creating something more powerful than it's created before? And we regulate it so only a small number of people have full access to it. What would that look like? And my view is that is something that is impossible to maintain current democratic society in that case. Democracy relies on voters, on people, having the ultimate power, having the ability to hold the state to the account. And we have this ability to vote. And in the end, the state is the most powerful entity. So in the case that a company holds the keys to power, that can't anymore be the case. At that point, a company holds the ultimate power, and specifically the small number of people in that company who hold the keys to those weights, the ability to use that model in full. Now, the difficulty is that if we start down this path even before AI has achieved superintelligence, and of course it might not, right? And if not, then that's a whole different discussion. And we certainly don't need frontier AI regulation if not. We only need it if we might be heading towards superintelligence. So what happens in the meantime? Well, in the meantime, we are creating very explicitly a particular kind of regulatory burden, frontier AI regulation, a regulatory burden which says you may not compete with the biggest and most successful AI companies until you have approval to even start. So this is the most explicit kind of regulatory capture opportunity I've ever seen in a policy regulation. It's explicitly saying you have to get permission to compete, unless you can convince us ahead of time that you're going to be less powerful than the most powerful companies. So if this happens, then we're adding an additional level of centralization to a technology that is already extremely centralizing. The reason it's an extremely centralizing technology is that there are positive feedback loops. The better the AI you have access to as a company, the better AI you can create. And therefore, the better products you can create with that AI, and therefore the more money that you pull in and the more power that you get. Like it's this kind of technology is a more centralizing, economically centralizing, power centralizing technology than we've ever seen before. We haven't before had this ability to self-improve using the technology itself. So we're talking about adding a regulation that explicitly makes it even more centralizing. So the question is, do we really want to head down this direction? Are we creating the very keys to a catastrophe that we were trying to avoid? And so we've got to think back to the way doctors think. First, do no harm. Do not create a cure that could cause the very thing that you are trying to avoid. It would be like destroying humanity's immune system. Now, why is that? Why is it like destroying humanity's immune system? That's because historically, in society, when the most powerful actors go awry, our immune system is for regular people to rise up and say, you know what, that's not okay. So we have had revolutions throughout history where people say, I'm sorry, but we're not prepared to be controlled the way you're controlling us. If the leaders of that society have access to technology dramatically more powerful than anybody else, then we lose that ability. Can you imagine 99.99% of society without full access to the models that underpin superintelligence trying to have a revolution against a tiny elite power structure that does? It's not going to happen, right? And in the meantime, it's going to be very hard, even before we get to superintelligence, for normal people to ever even attempt to ensure that they're part of that power structure, because the difference between the haves and the have-nots just gets bigger and bigger. So there is an alternative, right? And the alternative itself comes with risks, right? And these are risks that need to be carefully balanced. But the alternative is to rely on the Enlightenment ideals of democratization and access. And that is to say, well, what if we make sure everybody has access to the full versions of the models, to the weights, to the activations, to the ability to fully harness these? And that's like giving access to everybody to access to be able to write, to education, to computers, to the internet. And it's saying, you know what, people are probably going to do bad things with that. But we're going to be able to defend ourselves with the very technology that people have access to use offensively. So this is a very delicate balance, right? But in the absence of that balance, we have nothing to achieve the resilience we need. So I think we should be extremely careful, because there's no way to ensure AI safety of frontier models in an environment where we allow open source to be frontier AI models. But on the other side, there's no way to ensure that society has the ability to defend itself if we don't allow access to frontier open source models. So there's a very strong bifurcation here. There are some ways we can navigate this. The way that I recommend we navigate this is to try everything else first. And there's a very obvious everything else we can try first, and that is to massively beef up liability. Now, the problem is massively beefing up liability is going to be a disaster for companies like OpenAI and Google, which includes folks who are involved in writing this regulation. I don't think it's possible for people involved in these companies or in think tanks that have the same investors as these companies to ever strongly recommend really beefing up liability, because it might be a death knell to the companies themselves. If we were to say, okay, OpenAI, you can create whatever model you like, but if somebody uses that model to do harm, you're on the hook. And not only are you on the hook, but your directors are on the hook, your executives are on the hook. They could face criminal charges and go to jail for the things that the models that their company created did. Now, if we did that, you can be sure that we're going to have a huge amount of effort directed towards AI safety. And you can be sure that people are not going to even try to build things that they're not entirely confident they can control. If we were to massively beef up liability first, then that is a step that we can take, which is going to dramatically improve that intermediate safety situation prior to the point at which we get to artificial superintelligence, if that ever happens. And that's what we normally do. Normally we say, okay, if you build a car and the wheels fall off every time people drive it above 100 kilometers an hour, you're going to get in trouble. And if the executives knew that was going to happen, then they're going to get in trouble as well. Now, normally liability is much less toothy than it should be. The liability is very often quite toothless because there's been so much regulatory capture. And so when we see things like VW intentionally skirting regulations to create cars that are less safe than they should have been, the executives don't go to jail. Right? So that's why I say we would have to be very explicit about creating a regulatory regime in which it's safety first. Now, again, I'm not even sure we should do that. What I am saying is, before we go down this path of regulating frontier AI models at the point that you're not even allowed to build them without permission, and most people don't have access to the weights, to the full things, before we go down that path, go down all the other paths first. Because my view is if we start to try to ensure the safety of frontier AI models, in the process, by definition, blocking the ability to have open source frontier AI models, I think we are setting society down a path which we can perhaps never escape from, one which makes the chance of an AI-powered catastrophe dramatically more likely than it would have been otherwise.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Markus, would you like to add any comments, and Cullen as well?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I have lots of thoughts. Thank you very much, Jeremy, for laying that out, sort of those worries out so clearly. I'm sure Cullen also has lots of things to say, so I'll try to say some things briefly. Firstly, I'm interested in a clarification. So in the paper, we talk about lots of different ways that this regulatory regime could be set up. In particular, we talk about two different setups. One is this sort of licensing regime, and the other one is you have a regulator. That regulator mandates that you follow certain kinds of requirements, and they can identify and punish non-compliance with those kinds of requirements. When you talked about liability, it sounded to me like you were referring to the former. Is that right? Because that's how it works in the case of sort of automobiles, etc. There's a regulator. That regulator can identify your non-compliance, etc., and then they can punish you, they can fine you, and whatnot.
So I'm talking about liability for misuse, and so for a dual-use technology, general-purpose technology like an AI model, you could have liability happen at two main places. One is the user. So if I intentionally take an AI model and use it to create, I can't use it to create, but use it to design a bioweapon, which I then use to kill lots of people, I would expect to get in trouble. And so that would be liability for use. And I think that should certainly be as strong as possible. The next step is liability for development and liability for deployment. So if you built that model and put it up on the internet and provided access to it, then in this extreme liability scenario, I would say, okay, well, you could go to jail too, and your company could be bankrupted with punitive damages as well. And so these are the things we should do before we try to ensure safety. The point at which you try to ensure, and specifically ensure safety of development, it's fine to try to ensure safety of usage, because at that point, you're not trying to regulate a dual-use technology anymore, something that can be used very powerfully for defense of society. If you only try to regulate usage, then you're doing something like what the Europe's AI Act used to look like last year, where it was all about high-risk applications. That seems totally fine to me. I don't see the ability to destroy society by attempting to ensure the safety of high-risk AI applications, because they made a specific list. They said, look, here are some things that you could put AI into that could be harmful, so don't do that without permission. You can still train the model, right? And people can still have access to the weights, so we don't end up with the haves and the have-nots situation. So these are three things actually that we can do. We can beef up liability for use, beef up liability for development and deployment based on how it's used later, and we can beef up regulation of high-risk applications. And these are all much safer things that we can do than the potentially extremely unsafe approach of attempting to regulate the development of the underlying models.
Okay, so yeah, so I guess that does suggest to me that like a lot of the stuff that we talk about when we talk about, you might need to have a sort of a regulator that can mandate certain requirements. They can sort of punish you for non-compliance. That seems like we're more agreed than I initially expected.
Well,
in
just
addition
be
to that, I
careful
do
there.
think
So
that
compliance, this would be usage, right?
Yeah, exactly. It'd be sort
it's not it's not non-compliance with standards
and whatnot. Yes, exactly. So it would be. So I imagine that the sort of in the regime you would set up would be, or at least the one that we would propose would be something like, you should take great care to make sure that your model is not misused. If it is misused, then we can punish you, and that would presumably be proportionate to the kind of harm that results. In addition to that, I think you're right that sort of other kinds of liability, it might be some really quite useful tools. I'm currently thinking about writing some things about this. My main worry is, or sort of, I have a few main worries about this. One worry is that I expect it's just really a difficult tool to use if the harms are too large. If it's difficult to use liability as a tool to make sure that a nuclear plant developer acts sort of responsibly, because they don't have enough money to sort of cover all of the damages. And then it also just seems really quite difficult to sort of prove whether someone caused a particular harm. The causal chain will just be quite tricky. Cullen also has thoughts on this, I believe.
Yeah, so without taking a stand on liability one way or the other, it seems to me that this seems, if your goal is to ensure that as many people as possible have access to an AI technology, this is like extremely undermined by the goal of imposing liability on people who create that technology for how people downstream of them misuse it, right? So just accepting that as a goal for the sake of the hypothetical would not be like economically rational thing for the creators of this model to do, just to lock down the model even more, which I took to be a thing that Jeremy thought was extremely unsafe. Just to like, so like I think that's like a real cost for people who like want to create more access to these models to grapple with. Zooming back as well, I think like one thing that I think we probably agree with you, Jeremy, is that if it turns out to be the case that the AI technologies are more like writing or like voting or to take a more recent example, like cryptography, right, there was a big fight, that many of us are too young to remember firsthand, but over like the access to cryptography, right? And so if it turns out that these AI technologies are like that in the sense that widely democratizing technology, like widely democratizing access to these things is the like socially optimal policy, then I think we're in agreement that that makes a ton of sense. The thing that we want to take quite seriously is the prospect that A, that is not a guaranteed outcome, and B, that it's very hard to know ex ante whether that is the guaranteed outcome. These things, some of these models could be more like smallpox or nuclear weapons or just firearms. And like, I personally prefer to live in places where many fewer people have firearms. I do not think that they're a defense dominant technology. And so I think like the path that we're trying to chart here, which I agree with you is full of perils in either direction, it's walking on a tightrope, you can make errors in either direction, is that society has the right to make deliberative decisions about how wide access to this technology should be distributed based on the assessed costs and benefits without relying on either the unilateral action of companies to withhold this technology or the unilateral action of companies to open source this technology. That is ultimately like the ultimate democratic decision and should rest with democratic decision makers. And yeah, I think like the general approach is to generate more evidence for society to make this decision without making an irreversible step in the direction of open sourcing things, while completely agree that there are huge benefits if the technology is not widely distributed enough.
I mean, we've got to be very careful of these analogy making. When you make an analogy to nuclear weapons, you're bringing in a whole lot of baggage there, right? And it's not the right baggage because AI is not nuclear weapons. Now, I'm not an expert on this, but let's listen to people who are. So there was a recent article by Matt Corder, who is project manager for the Nuclear Information Project of the Federation of American Scientists, along with his colleague, who's an associate director for emerging technologies and national security at the Federation of American Scientists. And here's what they said. They said there's often a striking lack of understanding about exactly what is happening. They said this curious blend of keen interest and vague comprehension has fueled a torrent of chattering class clickbait teeming with muddled analogies. Take, for instance, the pervasive comparison likening AI to nuclear weapons, a trope that continues to sweep through media outlets and congressional chambers alike. They continue. While AI and nuclear weapons are both capable of ushering in consequential change, they remain fundamentally distinct. Nuclear weapons are a specific class of technology developed for destruction at a massive scale. In contrast, AI covers a vast field ranging from social media algorithms to national security to advanced medical diagnostics. It can be employed by both governments and private citizens with relative ease. You can't just bring in these kinds of comparisons because AI is not nuclear weapons, right? AI models can be freely copied. And so if you try to ensure safety of AI models, you will fail because the people who want them will either train their own or they will find ways to exfiltrate those that already exist through bribery, through blackmail, through social engineering, through theft. So trying to control that isn't going to work. Furthermore, it's not like nuclear weapons because this is a dual-use technology. The very things that we worry about also gives us the ability to say, hello, super intelligent AI, please help protect us. What are our key areas that we should be careful about with security? What do we need to harden? What should we take offline because we can't harden it, right? So I would just say be very careful of these analogies. This is a case of saying, if this is a very, very powerful technology, more powerful than anything that we've ever seen, I don't think that we can survive as a society and maybe even as a species if only those people rich enough to build their own models or with low enough morals to steal them have full access to them.
Yeah, I mean, all analogies have all kinds of problems. The same would hold for the analogy to voting, to smallpox, etc. And I think that the point that Cullen is making is just different technologies have different features in terms of how, sort of, one way to put it is how often dominant they are. And depending on that, we need to be making different decisions. We need to be making informed decisions about sort of how to govern the technology. Another thing that I'd like to just, I think a place where you and I just disagree is, it seems right to me, and I agree with you, that sort of it seems a few different facts. So one thing you said was, the state is sort of the most important actor currently. And that seems right to me, and that seems like a useful thing to continue to have be the case. I'd be worried about a situation where, private companies are or especially individual private companies can sort of dictate the direction of the world. Secondly, you said that sort of we have these natural forces towards something like oligopoly, or towards there being a smaller number of companies or sort of developers that sort of keep at the frontier and are able to continue to develop these models that soon will, might cost sort of billions of dollars to train, and might require expertise and access to material that is incredibly difficult to access. Those two facts to me tells me I want there to be more intervention from government here. I want government to have some means of determining, some means of sort of having an influence over how these systems are developed, why, sort of whether they are deployed, who has sort of is able to access them. All of these kinds of decisions, I want governments, I want some kind of democratic sort of accountability for, and so in my picture, what these kinds of regulatory interventions are trying to do is they're trying to sort of make sure that governments have more power than they might otherwise have. In addition, I think the kinds of regulatory interventions that I think are sensible will not just be of the form of sort of lock the model down. The sort of right kinds of interventions will often also look like make sure that external actors are able to scrutinize these models, make sure that they are able to do research on them. This might, in some cases, look like giving auditors and giving red teams access to the literal weights of the models to make sure that they can understand them. They can then sort of report what they find to government, and government can then make informed decisions about whether to sort of allow a certain development to continue. And in addition to that, I also imagine that sort of going forward, if it's the case that we end up in this kind of world that you're quite worried about, where sort of only a small number of actors have sort of access to these models. In that case, we can have governments step in and they can say, oh no, everyone or sort of a larger portion of society needs to have access to these models, at the very least via sort of service interfaces or sort of APIs. I think that is the kind of intervention that I'm imagining we might need in the future. And by taking steps towards making sure that governments are sort of more involved in the process of sort of the development, of the deployment of these models, I think that would push us in sort of a useful direction.
I don't think actually we do disagree on the role of governments. Where we disagree is the role of companies. My view is that if this is that powerful that it could cause a catastrophe, we actually need to remove the profit motive. As long as that is there, if the weights are controlled by and owned by companies, then it's not going to work, right? So it either needs to be open so that everybody has the ability as a society to control this themselves, or it needs to be dramatically more controlled and put in the hands of a democratically elected and effective state. An in-between point where there's a frontier regulation that gives the weights to big companies and provides a regulatory barrier to those wanting to join them is the worst of all possible worlds. So I think we have to actually take this seriously and say our options are either to say, yes, this is something where we think that society at large can defend themselves against an offensive capability more effectively if everybody has access to the weights, or if it genuinely is a technology where offense is so much dramatically easier than defense that it can't be control to the point that we actually have, existential risk, we can't make that technology be available in its fullest only to folks who have a profit and power motive. We actually need to do everything we can to take that away. And I think those are our two key options here. And again, I don't think we should be heading in a direction where we're giving the biggest companies more power and more ability to make more money in the meantime, because we're making it harder and harder for society to go down any of those two more safe and resilient paths.
Irene, with your hand up.
I love this energy. I love this passion. I very strongly agree, especially with Jeremy's paper, that we can't rush into anything. And I think there's a overall sentiment and just vibe that like intervention is needed. We don't want monopolization. We don't want concentration of power. And this question of how do we improve input is not just open sourcing as well. So it's where we're disagreeing here as a community, and also it's being reflected, I feel here, is the levers for operationalizing the many inputs that need to happen and what we're building upon, because it is not just the systems that exist today. We want to prepare for whatever people are expecting, maybe 3 months from now, maybe 10 years from now. Anybody who has clarity on that is making stuff up. So what and there's amazing commentary and questions in the chat that are also really highlighting these different levers. It's helpful to look at something like tangible that is compute. It's interesting to look at licensing, which I have shared, I think can be too burdensome. But the overall themes is what should we move forward specifically, and how do we avoid overfitting to magical solutions? Because I don't think open sourcing all model weights inherently is going to fix everything. I think there's a lot in the field of there's just a skew in who has the skills to engage with, or even the infrastructure to locally run a model. So even if you are to improve access, there needs to be a lot more groundwork on training, on research infrastructure. Even if you are to look into the compute side, that's not all of what leads to capability development. And if there's anything that we've seen from compute efficiency research, you can't anchor to any one component of a system. So I would love to make use of the 10 minutes that we have and think about how do we include, like Jeremy is saying, the many needed perspectives in the regulatory side, especially the folks who have more experience on the policy side and maybe can give that insight, and less experience on the frontier model, which is where the concentration of power argument is going.
And that calls our 10-minute warning. We have a lot of really good questions racking up in the Q&A. We actually have 44 questions, which we will never get to in this discussion. So I'm going to make the decision where we may just answer them in a follow-up post between the panelists, if you'd like, if any take your fancy. And I'd like to invite you to do any conclusive comments if you'd like to say anything more. I've really enjoyed hearing all of your perspectives, and I do wish that we had more time.
Yeah, I don't really know if I have any particularly super wise thing to sort of overarching things. I think these questions are incredibly important. I think I agree that sort of one should be careful setting up these kinds of regimes, and one needs to sort of consider all the upsides and downsides very carefully. I guess one particular thing that that I would be concerned with is this thing of sort of just how much we understand about what the capabilities of these models might end up being. I guess one way to operationalize that is if it were the case that I could sort of decide with 100% chance that there was some kind of regulation on frontier models. whether that happened today or whether that happened a year from now, with full certainty, I would probably choose a year from now, because at that point I would expect us to have a better understanding of these kinds of systems. But I think it's urgent and super important for us to start having these conversations now, because I do expect it's sort of likely enough that these technologies will be such that sort of we will need sort of governments to be involved in these kinds of decisions about sort of how models are developed, what kinds of safeguards are put in place, etc. Such that we just need that infrastructure, and my guess is that we should just start building some of that infrastructure already today.
Yeah, I'll offer a few closing thoughts too. I mean, first of all, I would just like to express my extreme gratitude to Jeremy, Irene, and some of the other people who have engaged critically with this work. I think these are the top level priorities for civilization right now, and so to have people willing to stick their necks out to really critique these things is extremely important to the intellectual process of figuring out what we do as a society. I see also, I don't know if he's still here, but I saw Adam Thier from the R Street Institute was attending earlier, and I highly recommend people check out some of his work for another great critical take. I think just zooming back for a second, I think the thing that I hope Jeremy and I agree on is that it's very possible for a lot of this to go wrong in a lot of different ways. And the type of regulatory regime that I want to aim for is one in which democratically accountable actors have the knowledge and kind of controllable ecosystem to work with to make the right decision in the face of all of these dynamics. And a lot of what we try to do with the Frontier AI regulation paper is describe a regime in which there is strong regulatory visibility into the Frontier AI development process and the flexibility of regulators to do anything from mandating that these AI systems be used in certain defense dominant applications to greatly restricting access thereto because they're just too destructive. And I think it's very possible that the regime we describe errs in some direction, and it is our attempt at describing the one that balances all these considerations well, and would very much welcome descriptions of regulatory regimes that balance improve on this kind of overall.
I would like to close by suggesting a specific thing for the audience to consider, which is I think you should tune your spidey sense to listen out for two things. The first is the co-location of two words, ensure and safety. Historically, these are two words that, when put together, can lead to very dangerous situations. We can't ensure your safety, and nobody can ensure your safety. And any attempt to do so is very likely to make you dramatically less safe. We need to consider this as a case of looking for balance rather than ensured safety. Attempts to ensure safety lead society instead to placing all of its trust into very powerful individuals and groups. And that is something that actually makes us dramatically less safe. The other spidey sense I want you to consider training is one in which look out for whether all of the suggestions or all of the proposals or policies in place are highly aligned with the economic interests of the people that currently invest in and own the companies with the most powerful AI. And whether the discussions are dominated by those people. And at the moment, the AI safety discussions are dominated by these groups. Now, there's very good reasons for that, which is that the folks most interested in AI safety created companies like Anthropic and OpenAI in order to study these models. But we've ended up in a situation kind of accidentally in this very unresilient situation where AI safety discussions are dominated by folks who have a vested interest in ensuring that companies continue to control this technology. And so I do think we need to be expanding greatly the voices that are involved in this and considering proposals in which these companies do not necessarily continue to have access to this kind of money and power. And so I think if you see proposals that are not saying things like, maybe we should consider companies having liability and even their executives having liability for misuse first and foremost, before we consider actually stopping people being allowed to compete with them, I'd be a bit suspicious of that, you know. So these are the two spidey senses I would say people should consider developing.
I think that actually introduces a really good future discussion and panel that we should have, actually. Thank you so much, everyone. In order for us to end on time, I'm going to close the session. We've actually saved all of your questions so that we can address them at a later date. Do contact us if you have a really pressing question that you would like us to pass on or answer ourselves. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you so much to our panelists. I wish that the audience could actually give you an in-person round of applause, but we can't. Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.